I bought pretty much every cut on the cow, and today I'll be going over everything you need to know about steak. From how to buy it to how to cook it and everything in between, it's my goal that by the end of this video, you become a steak master. And at the end of the video, I'm gonna taste each of these steaks completely blindfolded to see if I'm truly the meat guy and if I can get any of them right. And with that, let's get started. First things first, what exactly is a steak? Now for this video, we'll be classifying steaks as any cut of beef that's relatively tender, so we'll be excluding anything like a brisket or a rack of beef ribs. To break this down further, we're gonna start here with what I like to call the primary cuts. These are gonna be premium cuts like this guy here, our ribeye, this guy here, which is the tenderloin or filet mignon, the New York strip, and sort of included here as well is the T-bone, or in this case, porterhouse. These cuts are extremely premium and expensive, and typically things you'll see at steakhouses. Next up, we have what I like to call secondary cuts. These are gonna be cuts like your picanha, hanger, Denver, or skirt steak, generally a bit less premium, but in my opinion, the best value. And last up, what I like to call the tough cuts. In this case, think of things like any of the round. So top round, bottom round, eye of round. And honestly, these are kind of rough, not exactly ideal for a steak. And like the name implies, they're pretty tough. The first thing that we need to learn is how to choose the right steak. To do so, I'm gonna take you through each cut and start with the ones that I consider to be overrated. I already know that this is gonna cause some controversy, but overrated steak number one is this guy right here, the ribeye. This particular cut right here is a tomahawk ribeye, which means it has this long bone right here, but the steak itself is in fact a ribeye. There's no question that ribeyes are incredible. They taste amazing and they are super tender. However, I paid 38 bucks a pound for this, a lot of it being bone, and in my opinion, you can just find way better steaks for a fraction of the cost. But if you do have the budget, this steak for sure is a crowd pleaser. Next up, we have what is, in my opinion, the most overrated steak of them all, the tenderloin, aka the filet mignon. The tenderloin is in fact the most tender cut on the entire animal. However, it is extremely expensive, probably the most expensive, and what it really lacks is marbling, fat, and of course flavor. But what I will say is that this is a great entry-level steak. If you're with someone that doesn't think they like steak, give them a filet mignon, keep it rare, medium rare, and it's gonna be amazing. However, it's gonna cost you an arm and a leg. This is also a great time to talk about oxidation. As you can see, this steak is looking pretty rough, completely gray on the outside, but it still looks really nice on the inside. This discoloration is strictly due to the meat touching air, and it doesn't impact quality whatsoever. So oftentimes you'll find oxidized steaks on sale, and in my opinion, it's a great time to capitalize. This one kind of hurts for me to put in the overrated category, but we have the strip loin, or New York strip. I think of this cut as a nice balance between the super lean tenderloin and the more fatty ribeye. It's still very tender and juicy, but because of that, it is on the more premium end of price, and for that reason, I call it overrated. And I know at this point, some of you are probably thinking I'm crazy calling all these steaks overrated, but I just want to say that it is my own personal opinion, and just because I believe they're overrated definitely doesn't mean they're bad. My next overrated steak is this bad boy right here, the porterhouse. A porterhouse is literally just a fillet and a strip loin still attached by the bone. My problem with this steak is one, you are paying for a lot of bone. The second issue is that, as you can see, the fillet is way smaller than the strip. So on the grill, the fillet often cooks a lot faster, but ideally the fillet should actually be cooked closer to rare, while the strip closer to medium rare or even medium. But at the end of the day, this cut is an absolutely stunning centerpiece on the kitchen table. And honestly, for that reason, sometimes I find the premium price point is actually worth it. And not to mention, it is pretty cool having two cuts in one steak. We got ourselves a little visitor here, but our final overrated cut here is the flank steak. Now, I actually love flank steak, but recently I found it's really starting to gain popularity, and I feel like a lot of people see it as the only alternative to like a ribeye, strip, or fillet. And as such, it is starting to get a lot more expensive in grocery stores, when the reality is, in my opinion, something like a flat iron or even a hanger steak just tastes a bit better. But it's a great steak for marinades. The only key here is to make sure it's sliced against the grain for tenderness. And now we're getting into my all-time favorite underrated steaks, We're starting right here with the flat iron. Believe it or not, this is the second most tender steak on the entire animal, and it comes from the shoulder, so it gets tons of use and therefore incredible flavor. The insane thing about this cut is you can literally cook it from rare all the way to well done, and it'll still be extremely tender. Just make sure to slice it against the grain. Our next underrated cut is this guy here, the tri-tip. It's more common out on the West Coast. A lot of people don't know about it here on the East Coast, but smoke it whole and slice against the grain, and it's just incredible. And next up, the Denver. Just like the flat iron, this comes from the shoulder. It is a little bit less tender, but it is extremely beefy. And something I've realized about all of my favorite underrated cuts is cutting it against the grain is absolutely critical. But if you do so, you'll find that they're almost as tender as something like a ribeye. And this is where I start to get very excited. What we have here is the whole picanha. This is a cut really popularized in South America, but it has this huge, delicious fat cap on top with super tender meat on the other side. A great option is to cook this whole, but if you are cutting it into steaks, start by finding the grain and cutting with it. By slicing with the grain into steaks, by the time it's finished cooking, we can easily slice against the grain for perfectly tender bites with that juicy fat cap on top. Part of me wants to call the skirt steak overrated, but I truly love it so much. This is the inside skirt steak. It's characterized by these super loose muscle fibers, so it's absolutely phenomenal with a marinade. Throw it right on the grill for a nice char, slice against the grain, and you're in heaven. Next up, we have the top sirloin. This to me is just a solid weeknight steak. It is sort of lean, but sometimes you'll be lucky and even find a piece of the picanha still attached. Cook this to medium rare, and you're just looking at a pretty solid steak. Next up, the bavette. Now this cut can be tough to find in grocery stores, but it's actually very similar to a flank steak, just slightly better. It comes from a similar area on the cow, but it's usually a bit thicker with better marbling, and in my opinion, always a better choice. Last up, we have what is quite possibly my favorite underrated steak, the hanger steak. This is often called the butcher's cut because butchers would selfishly keep this one for themselves because it's so good. And in New York City, I literally got this whole steak for $5. I mean, this cut is insanely tender and juicy, and I genuinely can't believe more people don't know about it. And we've reached the section where Max starts to get sad because we have steaks that I would recommend not buying. We have the top round and the bottom round. Now don't get me wrong, there are some good uses for these. You can kind of pound them out into like a chicken fried steak situation, but generally speaking, these are gonna be extremely tough steaks. And even if you cut against the grain, in my opinion, it's way more worth spending a little bit of extra money for one of the previous steaks that I mentioned. And now we have the steak that I honestly hate most in this world. This guy here is an eye of round. This thing is extremely tough and pretty much has no flavor. In my opinion, it belongs in two places, either the trash or in beef jerky. If you are gonna cook this thing, the only way I recommend it is to kind of keep it whole, cook it like a roast, but make sure to slice it very thinly. Now the final steak that I recommend not buying is this guy right here, the chuck tender. As you can see, it has a very similar shape to the tenderloin, which is why it often gets confused. The reality is that this steak right here is not tender at all. Now, the reason I hate this steak so much is because one, it has the word tender in it, and two, it's often marketed and incorrectly perceived as being an extremely tender steak like a filet mignon. Okay, now that we've gone through every single steak, to round out this first section of how to purchase the perfect steak, I'm gonna fire off 5 additional last-minute tips. And the first is marbling. Now in America, there's 3 primary grades. We have select, choice, and prime. Prime grade steaks have the highest marbling, choice is second, and select, you pretty much want to stay away from those. That's essentially no marbling. So let's compare these 2 steaks. As you can see, this steak is filled with all this intramuscular fat. That is what we're talking about when we refer to marbling. Now over here, you can see the steak is pretty much completely red, virtually 0 marbling on this. But this is where things start to get interesting. Both of these steaks were sold to me as prime grade, which means in theory, they both should have incredible marbling. I will say this one looks great, but honestly this one over here doesn't even look like choice. So the bottom line is that price and grade actually don't matter too much. Make sure you're using your eyes and choosing the steak that looks best to you. Sort of related to marbling is tip number 2, which is developing the confidence to speak with your butcher. Now honestly, this is one that actually took me quite a while to develop. The reality is that butchers can be a little bit intimidating. You know, they're walking around with these giant knives, but most of the ones that I've had conversations with are extremely nice and helpful. Keep in mind, this is your money, you're paying for meat, so you should be very happy with with it. If you don't like the marbling, you don't like the particular cut, don't be afraid to ask them to go out back, try to find a new one, and make sure that you're walking out of there extremely happy. Tip number 3 is related to sales. Now, this is the very first thing I think about when I walk into the supermarket or butcher shop. Oftentimes you'll find incredible cuts that are highly discounted. This is particularly true, especially around like the holidays, Christmas time. You'll find rib roasts literally like 50% off. The other thing to keep in mind is I rarely walk into a store thinking I need to buy a ribeye. It's more so what looks the best at the best price. So I might initially be looking for a ribeye, but if the strips are on sale and look better, that's the option I'm going for. Tip number 4 is fresh versus frozen steaks. The bottom line for me is don't be afraid of frozen steaks, especially if they've only been frozen one time. I've found zero difference in flavor, texture, or quality. Tip number 5 is dry aged versus wet aged steaks. Now, 99% of steaks you find in the supermarket are actually going to be wet aged. All that means is that they're vacuum sealed and held inside that vacuum. The longer they're there, the more tender they get. The difference is a dry aged steak is also held at a long period of time, only it's fully exposed to air. During that time period, moisture comes out, so it's going to be a little bit more concentrated in flavor. Both are great options, but if you are willing to pay the premium for a dry aged steak, I always try to make sure they're aged for at least 30 days. That's when the true benefits come through. It is finally time to cook. Let's start by talking about how to season a steak. When it comes to seasoning a steak, there's literally a million directions you can go in, but I find that I always come back to the basics of salt, pepper, and garlic powder. The only thing to be mindful of is that garlic powder and black pepper do sometimes burn when cooked, especially in like a cast iron, but otherwise, this is a great trio. And besides that, the only other real rule of thumb for me is avoid anything with sugar. So there's a lot of great beef rubs out there that work fantastic. Just make sure they're very low or completely sugar-free. Now let's talk about salt. Should you use typical table iodized salt or a more coarse kosher salt? Now, in my opinion, kosher salt is always the move. Notice what happens when I use this fine iodized salt. Because the particles are so tiny, it tends to absorb super quickly, and it's pretty difficult to see how much you're using. Compare this to kosher salt, which is actually less salty due to the surface area. You can really see how much you're using and have a consistent layer. Not to mention, kosher salt is gonna help us out with texture a lot more as we develop that crust. Now let's talk about dry brining. All this means is seasoning your steak prior to cooking. You wanna do it at least an hour before, but ideally overnight. This is gonna give us two primary benefits. The first is that as that salt absorbs, you'll be left with a steak that's seasoned all throughout. The second, and possibly the most important, once fully dry brined, your steak will have an extremely dry exterior, which is gonna provide a huge benefit when it comes to developing a crust. Cooking these steaks side by side, notice how much faster and stronger the crust is developed on our dry brine steak compared to a steak that I seasoned just a couple minutes ago. The benefits are truly huge, and if you have the time, always dry brine. So we just saw what a nice crust looks like, and that brings us to our next point. When cooking a steak, there's two extremely important variables that we want to think about. The first is developing a really nice crust, and the second is cooking it evenly. But here's the problem. To develop a nice crust, we need super high heat. To cook it evenly, you kind of want to cook it a little bit slower so you get that nice edge to edge. So we're going to break our steaks down into two distinct categories. We have our thin steaks and our thick steaks. With thin steaks, the variable we want to focus on is developing that crust as quickly as possible. So for these, we use the direct heat method. Now for thick steaks, the most important variable is finding a way to cook them evenly. So in this case, I like to use an indirect heat method. So let's start over here. When I talk about indirect heat cooking, I'm mainly referring to something called the reverse sear method. All this means is that we're slowly bringing up the temperature of our steak in either an oven, smoker, or kind of offset on a grill to pretty much fully cook the steak before we sear it. The benefit here is we can get a really nice edge-to-edge medium rare and then finish it off by blasting it with extremely high heat to develop that crust. And in doing so, we get the best of both worlds. The two methods I'm gonna use today are one, throwing this tomahawk in a low temperature oven right around 250 degrees Fahrenheit. For the porterhouse, I'm actually gonna use the sous vide method, which is in fact a form of indirect heat cooking. Now that our tomahawk has reached just about 125 degrees Fahrenheit, it's actually fully cooked and at a perfect medium rare. The porterhouse has cooked at 130 degrees in that sous vide and is also completely cooked. The only thing we need to do at this point is give it a nice sear. And for this searing step, you can really do anything from throw it on a pan to a grill or even use a blowtorch. And we're left with 2 steaks that are perfectly cooked to medium rare. You can see that really nice edge to edge doneness, as well as a pretty nice sear. Next up, moving back over to our thin steaks, where I like to use a direct heat cooking process. This is gonna apply to steaks that are under about an inch in thickness, and I'm gonna show you how to nail the 2 most common methods of searing in a pan and also directly on a grill. The first is searing it directly in a pan. Now, best case, you wanna be using a cast iron and get it nice and hot. In general, the thinner the steak, the higher the heat. If it's a bit thicker, you can bring it down closer to medium. Focus on developing a really nice sear and feel free to flip it often for more even cooking. Once your sear is nicely developed, this is where you can add butter and butter-based if desired. Try to avoid burning the butter, but we still want to keep the heat hot enough so it's nice and bubbly just like this. And this is where having a great thermometer really comes in handy. Because we're cooking at such a high temperature, the carryover could be as high as 15 degrees, so I'm pulling the steak right around 115 internal. Even after removing from the heat, the steak will continue cooking during the 5 to 10 minute rest, and we're left with a perfect medium rare. For the second steak and direct heat cooking method, we're gonna throw this on the gas grill. Now, gas grills can be a bit finicky. That's why it's always important to get to know your grill. Try to understand which part is the hottest. In this case, our skirt steak is extremely thin, so we wanna sear this as quickly as possible. But as you can see, even though I'm using the highest heat I possibly can, it's difficult to achieve a really nice crust due to this thinness, and this is where dry brining would have come in handy. Despite the semi-average crust, we were still able to achieve a nice medium rare internal. Well guys, we have made it to the end of the video. Might have been a little bit boring, but either way, I do appreciate you guys. If you are still watching, drop a like on the video, make sure you're subscribed, maybe drop a comment, let me know what you think. But it is time to figure out if I can tell the difference between our steaks. We have our taste tester tie, number 1. This is gonna be completely impossible. I'm going with Denver, number 2. That is a filet mignon for show. If I'm 2 for 2 right now. Number 3. This one I'm gonna say flat iron, I guess. Number 4.
They all taste the exact same.
I'm gonna say flank steak. Number 5. I think 4 was the strip, I think 5 was the flank steak. Number 6. For now, I'm gonna call that the skirt steak. Do I have at least one right, Sylvia? Oh, don't even say. Number 7. Top sirloin, maybe. 8. New York strip? Maybe?
You already guessed New York strip.
Yeah, but can I just double up? 9. I think that's either the tri-tip or the bavette. Let's call it the bavette. Okay, number 10. Absolutely terrible top round. Number 11. Just put me down. I'm just gonna say tri-tip even though I know I'm wrong. Number 12. Literally no clue. Chuck tender? Last steak. It's chewy, but I think it's dry aged. I'm gonna say with the ribeye. Just tell me how many I got right. Please. Denver, the filet mignon for show. Flat iron? 4 was the strip, I think 5 was the flank steak. The skirt steak. Top sirloin. New York strip? Call it the buffet. Top round. Tri-tip even though I know I'm wrong. Chuck tender? They with the ribeye. I got 5 right. That's pretty good. That's incredible, actually. That's like a huge roller coaster of emotions because I was convinced that like I chose the ribeye when it was actually the eye of round, which I might have. But either way, I really hope you guys learned something and enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.